The woman's grip on her phone tightened as she urgently spoke to the 911 operator. "I'm telling you, there's a black kid causing problems." Her voice grew more insistent with every word, the certainty in her tone unmistakable. Nearby, the teenager in question remained unaware of the storm brewing around him. Jeremiah leaned back against an oak tree in Oakwood Park, basking in the warmth of the sun. He inhaled deeply, taking in the fresh scent of grass and flowers in bloom. His mom had promised to pick him up soon, and he was content to pass the time, lost in his own thoughts. A sudden, unsettling sensation crept up his spine, interrupting his peaceful moment. He blinked and glanced around the park, trying to pinpoint the source of his unease. His eyes landed on a middle-aged white woman sitting on a bench nearby. Later, he would know her name was Sarah. She was watching him with intense suspicion, her lips drawn tight and her eyes narrowed. Then, without a word, she rose from the bench and began walking toward him with stiff, deliberate steps. Jeremiah's discomfort grew, but he remained still. He had been to this park countless times and had as much right to be there as anyone else. But as Sarah drew closer, he sensed something was wrong. She stopped in front of him, her expression set, her voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her words clipped and accusing. "This is a family park, not a place for troublemakers. Get out of here, or I'm calling the police." Jeremiah's brow furrowed in confusion. He opened his mouth to explain, but Sarah's words struck him like a slap. The accusation stung, hitting him without reason. Anger bubbled up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to stay in control. "I'm not causing any trouble, Mom," he said, his voice even. "I'm just waiting for my mom. I have every right to be here." Sarah's face turned red with anger. Without another word, she dug into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking as she dialed 911. Jeremiah's eyes widened in disbelief. What had he done wrong? He slowly stood up, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "There's no need to do that," he said, his voice faltering. "I'm telling you the truth. My mom will be here any minute." But Sarah had already made up her mind. A grim satisfaction spread across her face as she spoke into the phone. "Hello, yes, there's a suspicious teenager here in Oakwood Park," she said, her voice clear and sharp, carrying through the still afternoon. Jeremiah stood frozen, a wave of cold dread washing over him as she continued describing him. He was being cast as a threat simply for existing in the park, waiting for his mom. The situation was slipping out of his hands. Jeremiah could feel the weight of injustice pressing on him. He knew all too well how quickly things like this could spiral, especially for young black men like him. The police would be here soon, and he was painfully aware of how such encounters could unfold. Jeremiah stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as waves of anxiety washed over him. He watched in tense silence as two police cruisers rolled into the park, their sirens blaring briefly before fading into silence. The flashing red and blue lights flickered across the scene, casting an eerie, surreal glow over the surroundings. His stomach churned. This was real. This was actually happening. The images of news stories and videos he had seen, of young black men whose encounters with law enforcement had gone horribly wrong, flashed through his mind. The officers moved toward him with purposeful steps, scanning their surroundings. Jeremiah tried to steady his breathing, recalling his mother's advice on how to handle situations like this. Keep your hands visible, avoid any sudden movements, and remain calm. The taller of the two officers spoke first, his voice flat and disinterested. "What's going on here?" His gaze flicked between Sarah and Jeremiah, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Sarah wasted no time, stepping forward and blurting out her version of events. "This boy has been hanging around for hours. He wouldn't leave when I asked him to. I'm concerned for the safety of the families here." Jeremiah's frustration surged, listening to Sarah twist the truth. His heart rate spiked. He wanted to correct the record, to explain himself, but before he could say a word, The second officer interrupted. "We'll get to you in a second, son," the officer said, his tone dismissive. The officers were now entirely focused on Sarah, nodding along as she continued to embellish her story. It felt as though they weren't even considering that Jeremiah might have a different perspective on the situation. Jeremiah could feel the grip on the situation slipping further away. His hands were still visible by his sides, but his pulse raced in his ears. The officers exchanged glances before one of them asked, "Got any ID on you?" Jeremiah's stomach clenched. "No, sir," he replied, his voice quivering despite his best efforts to stay composed. "I'm only 14. I don't have a driver's license." He saw the officers' disbelief in their eyes as they looked him over, their judgment now clear. They weren't just questioning him. They were forming an opinion about him. The weight of racial bias pressed down on him, and he realized he was being treated like a criminal just for being in the park. As the officers continued their rapid-fire questioning, a crowd began to gather. Several people had started recording with their phones, and Jeremiah could feel their eyes on him. His anxiety spiraled. He was standing there, in front of a growing group of strangers, knowing this moment, this humiliating, degrading moment, could soon be broadcast for everyone to see. Just as the situation seemed to be slipping beyond his control, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the tension. A sleek black SUV rolled into the park, and for the first time, Jeremiah felt a spark of hope. The officer's demeanor shifted almost instantly. They stood taller, their expressions changing from stern to surprised. A rush of relief washed over him. His mother had arrived. Mayor Angela Thompson emerged from the SUV, her presence commanding immediate attention. The chatter in the park hushed as she strode toward the group, her focus unwavering on Jeremiah. Every step she took radiated authority, and Jeremiah could see the determination etched into her expression. A wave of relief washed over Jeremiah, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. Yet, the tension in his mother's jaw told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "What's happening here?" Mayor Thompson's voice rang out, slicing through the silence. Each word was deliberate and firm. The officers snapped to attention, their earlier confidence quickly evaporating under the weight of her gaze. The officers hastily recounted the situation, but as they spoke, Sarah's accusatory tone faltered, losing its sharp edge beneath the mayor's piercing stare. "Excuse me," Mayor Thompson interjected, her brow lifting in disbelief. "What exactly made my son seem suspicious?" Sarah stammered, clearly thrown off balance. "He was just hanging around for hours. I thought." The mayor's voice was calm, yet cutting. "What exactly did you think?" "That a black teenager in a public park must be causing trouble." Sarah's face flushed deep red, her once unshakable certainty crumbling into confusion. She stood frozen, unable to find a defense for her actions. Turning to the officers, Mayor Thompson's expression shifted to one of quiet but firm disappointment. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone controlled, "this incident underscores a deeper problem. Did you consider whether bias played a role when you approached my son? Did you treat him with the same presumption of innocence that you would any other person?" The officers stood in silence, their heads lowered, unable to respond. With a gentle but protective hand on Jeremiah's shoulder, Mayor Thompson turned to face the growing crowd. "This is not just about what happened here today. This is about a larger issue. No child, no person, should ever feel like a criminal just for existing in a public space." As his mother spoke, a surge of pride swelled in Jeremiah's chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel so alone. The mayor's voice rang out, reverberating through the park as she addressed the crowd. "This situation demonstrates the urgent need for change in how we handle such matters. I am announcing today that we will implement widespread anti-bias training for our police officers and all city staff." For a moment, the crowd was quiet, some nodding thoughtfully while others exchanged wary looks. A man in the front spoke up, his tone skeptical. "How is this training supposed to make a difference?" he asked, his doubt clear. Mayor Thompson turned to face him, her voice calm but firm. Anti-bias training isn't an overnight fix, but it's an essential first step. It's about fostering awareness and giving our public servants the tools they need to recognize and challenge their own biases. Jeremiah stood silently, his thoughts churning beneath the surface. The officers hadn't seen him for who he truly was, a 14-year-old kid waiting for his mom. To them, he had been nothing more than a potential threat. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as they debated the mayor's proposal. Jeremiah, gathering his courage, finally spoke up. "I was just sitting here, enjoying the day," he said, his voice gaining strength. "In a matter of minutes, I went from feeling safe to feeling like a criminal. That's not right." His words hit home with the crowd. A wave of understanding rippled through the onlookers, and more than a few heads nodded in agreement. The same realization that had struck Sarah began to spread, the weight of what had just happened. Sarah, her cheeks flushed with discomfort, stepped forward hesitantly. "I didn't mean any harm," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I just thought I was keeping the park safe." Mayor Thompson's expression hardened as she met Sarah's eyes. "The issue is, ma'am," she said, her voice firm, "it shouldn't matter who his mother is. No one should be criminalized just for existing in a public space." Turning back to the crowd, the mayor's voice carried with newfound determination. "This incident has underscored the need for more action. Today, I am announcing the implementation of comprehensive anti-bias training for our police officers and all city employees." In the days that followed, the events at Oakwood Park continued to stir the community. Conversations about racial bias spread through schools, offices, and living rooms. People who had once remained silent began to find their voices. Local businesses displayed signs promoting inclusivity, and town leaders organized community forums to address racial profiling and bias. Jeremiah found himself at the heart of many of these discussions as his story gained traction on social media. He was invited to speak at his school's debate club about his experience. Initially uncertain about what to say, he stood before his classmates and spoke from the heart. "I was just sitting in the park," he began, his voice calm but strong. "I never thought anything would happen. I didn't think I'd be accused. But sometimes, people look at me and see something I'm not." His words struck a chord with his peers, many of whom had never experienced that kind of fear or discomfort simply by being in a public space. But they listened, and they began to understand. Mayor Thompson remained a staunch advocate for change. In her public addresses, she repeatedly stated, "Every unjust encounter erodes trust between communities and law enforcement. We must rebuild that trust, and that begins with acknowledging the biases we all hold." Small but impactful changes began to take shape. Police officers started engaging more with the community, building relationships rather than patrolling with suspicion. Local organizations launched mentorship programs for at-risk youth, offering them guidance and support. And Oakwood Park, once simply a recreational space, became a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice and understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jeremiah sat on a bench in the park, reflecting on the events of the past few weeks. His mother joined him, her presence a comforting anchor. "Do you think things can change?" he asked quietly. She smiled softly, wrapping her arm around him. "Change is never easy, but moments like this can spark progress. The key is to keep the conversation alive." Together, they sat in silence, the city around them buzzing with the possibility of a fairer, more inclusive future. Though the conversation was far from over, Oakwood Park had become a starting point. The journey toward greater understanding had just begun.